Thank you guys all for coming out to university on a Friday. Hi, welcome.
Hello.
So this is the first of hopefully a monthly lecture series I hope to host. Probably here at the university. I'm a professor here. I also founded the Psychedelic Society of Minneapolis, which is a private community that has a somewhat strict screening process because we want to make sure we have legitimately interested psychonauts joining the community that aren't looking for access to drugs or trying to sell drugs or aren't law enforcement. So the community is a little strict in terms of membership, so I decided to start a more public-facing group to really kind of get some educational content out there about psychedelics, and particularly like the neuroscience around psychedelics, because I'm a neuroscientist myself, and I'm trying to actually develop a course here at the university to teach this sort of as an official class here at the university, which takes some time, and so I want to be able to pilot content with the community and also help with education and outreach about this very exciting yet highly controversial topic. So for this first one, I'm going to talk about some of my own research that I've done over the last couple of years looking at ayahuasca as a potential treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. So just a big disclaimer right now. So all this information that I'm presenting to you right now is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Like I said, I'm a neuroscientist, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a medical doctor. So all the research I do is for understanding how the brain works and how we respond to trauma and how different therapeutic mechanisms might be helpful for that, but I myself am not a clinician that can give ayahuasca to people with PTSD. If you are interested in that route, there are clinical trials that are currently being done throughout the United States and in Europe and other countries that are giving people different psychedelics in a clinical trial setting, both to look at healthy populations as well as looking at people with different diagnosed conditions like depression, PTSD, OCD. But being in a clinical trial is not a guarantee of any benefit from that clinical trial. The clinical trial itself is a science experiment. And so being involved in a clinical trial means that you're kind of donating your body to science and helping the scientists understand if there's any potential or risks for this new therapy to treat said disorder. And being involved in a clinical trial is very time intensive. The inclusion and exclusion criteria are very rigorous. It's very hard to get into a clinical trial, and sometimes they can take up to 10 months of your time throughout the year. So it's not like you're just going to get to sit in a room and trip and have fun if you want to be in a psychedelic clinical trial. It is a lot of work, so just keep that in mind. There are also options for gaining access to legal experiences elsewhere. So there's retreat centers out in the world that offer ayahuasca and magic mushrooms and things like that that are technically legal or decriminalized. And so you can also find links to that on our website. Okay. So first I want to give you a little background about who I am, for those of you who don't know me or aren't in the Psychedelic Society, and how I became interested in studying ayahuasca for trauma. Then I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what ayahuasca is, and then also how I think and how I hypothesize this is a potential therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then I'm going to go into some results of a study I've been conducting for a couple of years now, which is an anonymous online survey of people using ayahuasca in various naturalistic settings to treat their PTSD or depression or addiction. It was kind of casting a wide net, so I'll just give you some preliminary results from that. So first, who am I? How did I get involved in ayahuasca research? So I did all my training in undergrad and graduate school in the realm of studying trauma and sort of animal models of trauma and neuroscience. But I had been a psychonaut myself. I had tried psychedelics when I was in high school. I had always been kind of interested in them. And in 2008, when I was in graduate school, I happened to go to Burning Man. It was like my second time going to Burning Man. Who here has heard of Burning Man? Oh, good. So I'll have to explain what it is. So who here has heard of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies? Okay, good. So I first discovered them at Burning Man in 2008. There was this beautiful camp called Entheon Village. It was Fractal Nation, then Entheon Village, and now I think it's the Foam Dome or something run by Dr. Bronner's and MAPS. And they had all these lectures at Burning Man about people at Johns Hopkins and UCLA doing psychedelic research using psilocybin and LSD in patients. and doing this at like universities. And I thought, wow, this is actually a job. Like, people could make this a career. Like, if I want to finish my degree, I still hadn't finished my PhD at the time, but if I wanted to make this my actual career, I could. And so I just started asking around, trying to figure out how can I get into this field professionally. But then, you know, I kind of came back from Burning Man, had some stuff happen in my life, tried to finish my dissertation, and by the time I finished my dissertation, I was kind of jaded with science and didn't really want to do it anymore. I had kind of a little bit of trauma myself from doing animal work, which is really hard, you know, if you don't like killing things. So it was very upsetting, and I wanted to leave science altogether. And somebody had told me about ayahuasca. I'd never heard of it before, and that there was this retreat center down in Peru that was giving people ayahuasca. Particularly, they were trying to target veterans who had PTSD, who had, you know, exhausted all their options. And the center was run by a former, he was Marine Corps. And he was a Wall Street banker, had tons and tons of money, and decided to buy 400 acres down in the Amazon. Welcome. And would pay for people to go down, so people that couldn't afford to spend $3,000 to go to Peru, mostly, like I said, military veterans, but he was also taking other people that seemed like they were maybe down on their luck, didn't have the money, but could really benefit from this therapy. And I happened to be granted one of these free trips. I was kind of in a down point in my life. I just got divorced, I just graduated from my PhD, I was in severe debt, so I didn't have any money or the bandwidth or interest to make that kind of a journey. So he sent me down there, and I was a little nervous going down there by myself as a woman with like 12 other big military dudes, you know, so it was a little jarring at first, but you know, and I had my own interesting experiences with ayahuasca when I was down there, but the thing that really inspired me while I was down there was watching them kind of go through their process of being very agitated and aggressive and angry, struggling with their symptoms, and seeing them soften up and seeing them transform during the 2 weeks that I was down there was very inspiring. And so I came back to the United States. This was in between my graduate work and my postdoc. So I came back to the United States kind of hell-bent on, this is where I'm going to take my career. I'm going to somehow find a way to study ayahuasca for post-traumatic stress disorder professionally. But I wasn't a psychologist, I wasn't a clinician, I didn't know anything about plant-based psychedelics. This was all very new to me, so I was trying to figure out how could I actually get into this research. And so I kind of came back, and I initially reached out to Rick Doblin, who's the head of MAPS, and said, I happen to, actually I'll go back one, because I said, so this was my actual trip the first time around that I went, and this was actually a second trip that I went down. I was asked to be on this show called Drugs, Inc., having just gotten back from this trip. And I was by any means no expert, but on the show they just wanted someone with a PhD or a doctorate to say this is the expert on this topic. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll be that person. It was a little weird. But it was a documentary about the therapeutic potential of hallucinogens, even though the entire series, the show Drugs, Inc., is really aimed at demonizing drug use and the dealers and the users. But this one episode was really focused on the positives about it. So I was very happy to be involved with that. But what was really great about that was then it sparked this relationship with Rick Doblin, because he's the one that put me in contact with this documentary crew, because they just contacted him, and it was just kind of this interesting, you know, good timing, serendipitous encounter of being able to reach out to him and filling the exact niche they were looking for. And so for a couple of years, I was going back and forth with Rick Doblin and some other people at MAPS trying to get this idea out there of studying ayahuasca for PTSD. And so I just kind of started putting myself out there in the psychedelic community, going to different meetings. We were talking about, I'm wearing this shirt that says Support Cognitive Liberty. This is a group called ERI. It stands for Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education. And so right before one of MAPS's psychedelic science conferences in 2013, they hosted this women's entheogenic symposium that I was asked to speak at, and just kind of talking about my hypothesis that I had about ayahuasca for PTSD. And so that got the idea out there. And then I was asked to speak at Psychedelic Science on the same topic by Rick Doblin, which was really great. And then from that, I was able to develop a collaboration with a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and we were able to get some other work products. I won't go into the details, but I've just been able to kind of present with all these awesome people at various psychedelic conferences around the world, ultimately to be able to build myself up as a psychedelic scientist, which has been somewhat effective. And I apologize, this slide is out of order, but this is just to say like the main overarching goal of the research that I focus on in my lab, both when I was in San Francisco as well as my lab here at the university, is to study trauma. But trauma is this very complex thing, and it sort of is at the heart of a lot of different major mental illnesses and a lot of things that we think of as, you know, their own diagnostic categories like depression and addiction and anxiety, when in fact they might just be symptoms of some earlier adverse event that happened that are kind of manifesting as these different things that have a lot of overlap in terms of their symptoms. And this is a sort of an evidence-based model I'm building to kind of capture all of the information that exists in the literature about the scientific evidence to support different psychedelic drugs and MDMA and cannabis and ketamine to treat these various disorders. And if you want to know more about this, I won't go into the detail of that. For today's talk, we can dig into this throughout this sort of series. This is a monthly lecture, but what I really wanted to focus on was my contribution to this network, which is looking at ayahuasca for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the link to my website here, if you want to dig into this, and each of these would be a link where it would show you the actual research papers for each of these indications. And so regarding ayahuasca, this is a really great review for any of you that really want to dig into the weeds of everything that's been published or studied, at least up till 2016. I haven't seen anything really great come out since then. I mean, there's been a few clinical trials of depression that have come out, but it's basically kind of all been the same study out of Brazil. And that's also included in here, some of their earlier pilot work with that. But this really digs into the pharmacology, all the neuroscience, and all the therapeutic indications that ayahuasca has had throughout the couple decades that a lot of people have been working on this, including our very own Dennis McKenna, who used to work here and also was part of the Psychedelic Society before moving on to Canada. Yeah, this is a really great primer if you want to just kind of dig in and read about all of the nitty-gritty details about ayahuasca. So getting into kind of the meat of what I want to talk about today is, so how could ayahuasca be effective for post-traumatic stress disorder? So first, what is ayahuasca? How many people here have heard of ayahuasca? Okay, good. And you don't have to answer, but how many people have tried ayahuasca? Okay, good. So, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, although it sounds like most of you are, ayahuasca is kind of an admixture tea that is made by boiling two plants together that grow in the Amazon. One of them contains these beta-carbolines, which are like harmine, tetrahydroharmine, and harmala. And those all live in this plant here. It's called Banisteriopsis caapi. This is a plant that grows in the Amazon. It takes a very long time to grow to reach certain, a good amount of concentration of these beta-carbolines. And what these do is they act as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And that's important because the other compound in ayahuasca, it comes from this plant, Psychotria viridis, although this is just one type of plant that has DMT, dimethyltryptamine, so that's the major psychedelic component of ayahuasca, and also something that people just take on their own. However, if you were just to smoke DMT, as most people do, it's a very short acting experience. It's like maybe 5 to 20 minutes, and then it's gone, and you're kind of just catapulted into this alternate reality without any context. It's a little disorienting and bizarre, although some people really, really enjoy it. But if you were to try to ingest it, just eat it, it's not orally active because you have these enzymes in your gut that will immediately break it down, and so you don't experience the effects of it. But when you take these two plants together, which is kind of interesting because they don't grow anywhere near each other in the Amazon, and yet somehow some shaman was able to figure out that if you put these two things together, it induces this amazing experience. So when you boil these two plants together, which for anyone that's kind of interested in the chemical structures, these are all the different beta-carbolines that are in the Banisteriopsis caapi, and then this is the dimethyltryptamine compound that exists in this plant. But like I said, DMT can be extracted from lots of different plants, not just this one. And it's been found in 50 other plant species and was always hypothesized to be produced by mammals, but we didn't know for sure because, like I said, it's broken down very quickly, so it's almost impossible to measure in a living being. But thanks to animal research, they were actually able to recently discover that it does get produced in the brain. I think maybe it was coming from some of the ventricles. It wasn't coming from the pineal gland, which is what a lot of people had hypothesized. And so this paper was able to kind of debunk that and say it's in there. We think it's coming from some of the ventricles. It might be circulating in the CSF and the cerebrospinal fluid. But yes, in fact, our brains do produce this, which is interesting and sort of like begs the question that Dennis McKenna always likes to talk about is, why does this compound exist? It induces such profound psychedelic experiences, mind-altering mystical experiences, and it's a molecule in our own brain. So is it really this spirit molecule that a lot of people brand it to be? But that's kind of a topic for another discussion. Okay, so getting back to the topic of the talk. So kind of giving a little overview of what ayahuasca is. So now, what is post-traumatic stress disorder? I mean, I'm sure most people are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, but I just want to give you kind of a brief overview kind of the circuitry involved and what specifically it is. So post-traumatic stress disorder is essentially kind of a maladaptive coping or sort of a bad form of learning. So it's normal to have strong reactions to life-threatening situations when we're exposed to something potentially traumatic. And normal adults will have a decrease in this reaction when the threat is no longer present. But people that have PTSD or predisposition to develop PTSD will have a persistent reaction that will stick around even when the threat is gone. And so they'll have these triggering symptoms of being in this fight or flight response, even though there's no actual imminent danger in their environment. So they're in this constant stressed state, which is very unhealthy for the brain and the body. And in order to, and these symptoms can get exacerbated by developing unhealthy coping mechanisms to avoid that type of response, which can lead to things like addiction or trying to avoid triggering stimuli, which might seem like a kind of a good way to avoid suffering, but in the long run, that's what I mean by maladaptive, is trying to not engage with these things or work with these triggers actually ends up making you less able to handle them during subsequent exposures to them. So it's really good to try and work with these triggers and find a way to help your body desensitize to them, which is where potentially psychedelic therapies like ayahuasca and MDMA might be effective, because they can help kind of desensitize the system to those kind of responses. So let me kind of get into the mechanisms of that. So there's different types of PTSD depending on various factors that are very hard to disentangle. This is actually a major focus of my lab, is trying to figure out what are these different trajectories of trauma, how can we predict them, how can we treat them. So there's a lot of things that happen to a person throughout their entire life that we can't control as either scientists or clinicians trying to figure out what's going on with someone. All these things, we call them pre-traumatic risk factors, make you either at risk or resilient to any potential traumatic exposure you might have as an adult. And so once all that's sort of understood and you're exposed to a traumatic event, depending on that will determine kind of which trajectory you're gonna fall into in terms of symptom development. So I'm coupling these with what I'm calling post-traumatic risk factors, because these will be things that, like I said, normal people, if they don't have any of these kind of pre-existing conditions or genetic risk factors, they might have this normal adaptation where they're exposed to something and it's initially jarring, but then they can resolve any symptoms and not go on to develop PTSD. People that do develop PTSD but then are able to recover usually are those who have access to treatment, they have good health care, they have a good social support system, they have a partner of some sort, some aspect of social support and family dynamics and other aspects of kind of healthy lifestyle that's able to make them more responsive to treatment if PTSD does develop. Yeah.
What's typical treatment?
So things that are currently used, people use SSRIs, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy. There's quite a lot of treatments that are effective, but they're not effective for everybody. So I don't know what the success rate is for each of those therapies, but there's clearly an unmet need because people with PTSD are killing themselves at a very rapid rate, specifically, particularly veterans. So it's important that we understand who are these people that don't respond and why, and how can we intervene to make these therapies more successful, which is where psychedelics has been kind of helpful as this alternative when these other kind of first line options don't work. Okay. For persistent PTSD, this will be somebody who maybe develops treatment resistance because they don't have access to a good network or social support or therapy, and then they'll go on to develop these maladaptive coping strategies like addictive behaviors, avoidant behaviors that will then exacerbate the symptoms, and that's going to be harder to treat in someone like that. And then there's this thing called complex PTSD, which is when someone is either repeatedly traumatized throughout their life and their PTSD is just so nested in so many different complex things that it's really hard to disentangle what exactly was the thing that traumatized them so they can get over it and resolve their symptoms, or they're in an ongoing traumatizing situation such as a domestic violence relationship, or they're in an active war zone or a violent urban area. So these kind of things can create complex PTSD, which is just very, very difficult to treat because they're either being continually traumatized, even if you can help them, the trauma is always there in their life, or their symptoms are just so complex that clinicians have a hard time figuring out how to treat them. Okay. So next I want to get into kind of the neuroscience of how all this works and what different systems and circuits are involved. So this is just kind of giving you an overview of normal control in the human brain. So this is involving the prefrontal cortex as well as the HPA axis and the limbic system. So the prefrontal cortex kind of acts as like this top-down control to provide context to everything that you're experiencing. And then the HPA axis involves the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal cortex. And that's kind of involved in your fight or flight response. And all of that is kind of also controlled or inhibited by the limbic system. So that would involve the amygdala. The amygdala is a part of your brain that's involved in emotion. So if you have fear or love, these are things that pop up in the amygdala. And this is usually triggered by a memory, which are stored in your hippocampus, or formed in your hippocampus and maybe stored in your cortex, but that's still kind of up for debate and under investigation with animal models. And just to kind of orient you to what this kind of figure looks like. So the black arrows means that there's activation of one part of this circuit to another, and the red lines indicate that there's an inhibition. So the way that this is supposed to work is, say you have a memory of something, it triggers an emotional response that would trigger your HPA axis, your fight or flight response, which would then cause you to release adrenaline. This is that kind of surge that you get when you're nervous about something. But the system is designed so that once you release adrenaline, it kind of works to auto-regulate itself and shut this whole thing off. Because if not, then you're going to have, adrenaline stimulating in the hippocampus, but then, if it's not auto-regulating itself here, it can say, hey, we don't want this adrenaline in our system, and then it can also shut it down from here as well. And then also the prefrontal cortex is good at sort of saying, hey, this emotion that you're having isn't related to anything. So like if you're having fear about something and it's just a thought, your prefrontal cortex should say, this isn't actually happening, it's okay, and it'll shut it down. So there's multiple ways to kind of keep the system in balance. For someone that has PTSD, there's a dysregulation of all of this. So various stressors can come along, either a psychogenic stressor, so this would just be a thought that you have, like you're laying in bed, you're thinking about something, it sparks a reaction, an emotional response. That would be a psychogenic trigger. A physiological trigger would be like there's a tiger in front of you and you need to move, that's an actual physical threat. Or something that looks like a threat. So in people with PTSD, this is hyperactivated. And so what happens is you have this massive flood of adrenaline that's flooding the system. And it's just too much and too overwhelming for it to basically auto-regulate and shut down. So what happens is you get this hyperactivation of the circuit, which then kind of makes the hippocampus not function properly, and it's not able to regulate this HPA axis as well as it was, as well. It looks like it's turning off this top-down control from the prefrontal cortex, and doing this kind of in a chronic state. If this is happening all the time, people with chronic PTSD actually have atrophied hippocampus, because if you're constantly stimulating it, it causes this sort of like excitotoxicity in the hippocampus, and you're going to start getting degeneration or shrinkage of those cells because they're not getting the stimulus that they need, and they're getting too much of what they don't. Okay. So, to your question, Corey, there are therapies that can help with this, and so some of these that work are things that try to hit different aspects of this circuitry. So cognitive behavioral therapy is good at really trying to get at that sort of higher reasoning aspect of your brain, to kind of retrain your brain to associate certain contexts to different stimuli, so that you can kind of change the way your brain responds to information at sort of that higher top-down level. SSRIs are good because they can actually reduce that activity in the amygdala, so that you're not getting this overactivation of this HPA axis. And then you can actually restore this control that you see. Specifically for PTSD, there's a thing called exposure therapy, which can be very effective, but it also can be dangerous and re-traumatizing for people if not done correctly. So if somebody's PTSD is very, very severe, this could actually be counterproductive and just be a re-traumatizing therapy for them. And if the therapist doesn't know what they're doing, if they're not very well trained in exposure therapy, and they don't have the right tools or support, and they don't understand the full weight of the symptoms of their client, it could actually be counterproductive and make their symptoms worse. So the thing about ayahuasca that's interesting, and you'll be able to tease all this out from that review I cited earlier, that goes into all of this, but ayahuasca is like this combination therapy where it incorporates aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy in parts of that psychedelic experience that you're having, or with the shaman that you're working with. It acts like an SSRI, and it also acts like exposure therapy because it itself will activate the HPA axis. So a lot of work that's been done on ayahuasca has shown that it can kind of have this activating response. But if you're trying to change the way that system responds, that's kind of what exposure therapy is trying to do, is engage the circuit, turn it on so that you can change the way that it's responding subsequently to subsequent triggers. So if done correctly, theoretically, it could potentially work if it really is capitalizing on all of these different therapies that do tend to work for PTSD, but doing so in this combinatorial way that might be better than all of these things on their own. But it does have risks because of this exposure therapy element, and for some other things I'll get into in a minute. So kind of getting back to my exploration of this, so back in 2012, this was kind of my first introduction of this hypothesis to the psychedelic research community. So me and a psychiatric nurse practitioner, Julie Megler, she's actually also one of the Erie people, her and I linked up, and we started kind of just writing things and giving talks at places and trying to get this idea out there, because we really wanted to work with MAPS to try and design a clinical trial to give people ayahuasca that had PTSD and see if it would help. And I'll just say, this was some data that we published in this book that was published in 2014. It was called The Therapeutic Use of Ayahuasca. And this was data that I collected from those veterans that I was down in Peru with back in 2010. And they were kind enough to share their trip reports with me, and so I just kind of did. I wasn't really sure what to do with the information, but I decided to, it was really big on word clouds at the time, so it was before I figured out what natural language programming was and all that stuff. So I just threw this into a word frequency calculator, and the thing that popped up, the biggest thing was medicine. These guys really thought this was medicine. And it's kind of anecdotal. It's not really, I think, evidence that ayahuasca can cure PTSD, but it was kind of an interesting nudge in the right direction that maybe this is a valuable route to explore for people with PTSD where nothing else is working. And then thinking about people's trip reports, I naturally thought maybe I can see if this holds any truth in Erowid. So who here has heard of Erowid? Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Erowid.org, it's an online database that's been around since the 90s, like when people first started having websites. They've been around since then. And it's a public database that's free to use and access that has trip reports and information about dose and weight and time course, and then people will submit these sometimes very long and detailed trip reports, and then when they upload the data to Erowid, they're asked to categorize different things that they sort of thought their experience was like, and so that's what these things are on the bottom. So just kind of the general, this is how many we have, first timers, combinations of drugs, retrospectives, and so this was a search I did specifically for ayahuasca, and based on the categories, I was surprised that people were reporting a lot of difficult experiences. But if you'll notice right next to it are the bad trips. So they weren't actually calling difficult experiences the same thing as bad trips, because a difficult experience can itself be very therapeutic if you can channel it in the right way. So it was interesting that they were kind of picking up like, yeah, it was hard. I mean, ayahuasca is hard. It's a 6-hour intense altered reality, and you're barfing and sometimes crapping your pants, and it's just like not a pleasant thing to go through, but people still want to do it because clearly there's something about it that's worth it. And it could be that people are finding that they're having these glowing and mystical experiences that seem to be kind of at the core of what is so therapeutic about this. So limited data, but after we kind of got that notion out there, there was a lot of people focusing on ayahuasca for PTSD, and it sort of blossomed from there, and that was exciting that there was interest and a lot of people picking up on this. But it was also, I feel like, being overhyped in the media and being over sensationalized and branded as this magic bullet cure for PTSD and other major mental illness, when in fact, like, nothing really does that, except for like if you have sepsis and you take antibiotics, like nothing really just works like that, you know. So I was a little nervous about all of this, and as the media attention around it grew, I became more and more uncomfortable about it, and sure enough, bad reports started to come out of the Amazon. The center that I went to back in 2010 actually was at the center of a big controversy. Some kid from Sebastopol went down there and died overnight, and the shaman buried him in the jungle and lied about it, and, you know, lied to the authorities, lied to his parents. It was awful, and it was a huge scandal. There's been other things that have happened, you know, lots of shady shamans. You know, there's this thing called Ayahuasca tourism, where they're really branding these as cures for us, you know, Americans and us gringos that can go down there and we'll heal all your woes. And there's a lot of sexual abuse that's happening. There's a lot of robberies and just a lot of exploitation that's happening. And it's also happening, like, the demand is also depleting the supply of these plants in the Amazon as well. So I would say if you're thinking of going down to Peru to do ayahuasca, to do some research on the retreat center you're going to. Does somebody you know, have they been there? Do they trust the shaman? And is there sort of like an ethical approach to how they're harvesting these plants? So some of these centers are actually just growing their own plants on site rather than going off into the jungle and picking these 20-year-old vines. So I would say, you know, if you're interested, maybe do some homework on that and make sure it's safe. In order to address all this, because there wasn't actual evidence for this therapeutic potential or the risks, you know, a lot of it was anecdotal. So I wanted to start a study. I was having a really hard time getting an actual clinical study started in the United States with ayahuasca, because it's an admixture. It's a combination of plants that don't grow here. So it's like importing things from Brazil or Peru, dealing with the FDA, and trying to come up with a standardized way to boil two plants together to get the concentrations you want. And just after several years of trying to navigate that and figure it out, it just was so much of a headache. And in the meantime, I was like, well, the data's out there. I know it is. People are talking about this. They're claiming that it works. Let's see if we can harness that information. And at the time, I was watching all the work coming out of Johns Hopkins and Roland Griffith's lab, and they were doing all these anonymous surveys. And I thought, well, that's an easy way to get data. So I just decided to start this survey, and this was in collaboration with MAPS. They gave me some money to fund this survey, and so this was an anonymous online survey aimed at getting information from people that had taken ayahuasca in whatever context, either to treat their PTSD or not. We didn't require people to have a diagnosis of PTSD. We encouraged people that had just tried it for various other reasons to submit their information as controls. But like I said, it was all anonymous, and there are some limitations to this when thinking about the results moving forward. So like I said, it's an anonymous online survey. It's retrospective and cross-sectional. So what that means is we're asking people to remember at some time in the past when they took ayahuasca and how they felt about it. And then just cross-sectional, meaning we're kind of asking them for like a single snapshot about their experience. There's obviously variability in set and setting, because we weren't saying only people that have done this in Peru or been to this one retreat center. Just anybody who tried ayahuasca, let us know where you did it, how long has it been, how many times did you do it. And then the survey was limited to English-speaking participants, because I just didn't have anyone on my team to translate the survey into other languages. But I think moving forward, it would be good to have versions of this in Portuguese and Spanish for the large populations in the Amazon that take this, that don't speak English. So in terms of, so first I'm going to start off with some qualitative results. So what that means for those of you who aren't knowledgeable about like data science and ways to analyze data, you can either look at qualitative data or you can look at quantitative data. So qualitative is like looking at these trip reports and really trying to dig out themes and information that you can derive that kind of have more meaning, but are kind of harder to sift through. You have to just sit there and read them. So as somebody that likes to just look at numbers and crunch data, like that's not very appealing. And so initially when I started this study, I was just focused on a lot of quantitative data. I want graphs. I want to show that we have reductions in symptoms and this metric. But in reality, that was actually kind of boring in trying to learn about what's going on with ayahuasca. And when I started reading the open-ended responses that I had people submit, I was learning so much about the kind of variety of experiences that people have with ayahuasca, and I feel like I was able to really understand what their experiences were like better by actually reading their first-person reports rather than trying to force them into some box about, tell me how your symptoms reduced in this measure. So I'll get into that later, but right now I want to go through kind of the more interesting qualitative information. So for this survey, I stopped collecting data to analyze for this specific paper that I wrote at the end of 2017. So we had about 1,000 people that had submitted their results to the survey at that time. We usually get about half of the people that actually finish it, and so part of the consent for this was that they had to complete the survey in order for their data to be allowed to be used according to the IRB protocol. I also had an additional question at the end if people, for whatever reason, once they completed all this information and shared their story, then they just didn't feel comfortable with that data being included. I gave them an option to opt out at the end. And then there was one participant that was under 18, which our IRB was not okay with, so I dropped that person. And so we have a final cohort of 520 people for this data I'm going to show you, and about half of them had a self-reported diagnosis, either a past or a current diagnosis of PTSD. Any questions so far?
You said it was self-reported PTSD? Oh.
Yeah, we had no way to, because it's anonymous, we don't have a way to contact their clinician, but I also had a self-report, the PTSD checklist in there to verify whether they were symptomatic or not, which has its limitations, but it's better than just them saying, yes, I have PTSD or not. So in terms of the qualitative analysis, this was sort of a new venture for me, being more of a quant, as we're called, where you just want to look at all the numbers. So this was something, it's called grounded theory, where you try to look through a bunch of texts and try to identify common themes that exist in the information. And so two of the questions that I had was, tell me about your ayahuasca experience. Did you find it to be dangerous, yes or no, or helpful, yes or no, or unsure? And so of the people, it seemed like most people were saying this was in fact a helpful experience. So the black bars mean that they answered yes, that this was a helpful experience, or yes, this was a dangerous experience. So obviously a lot more, and then it's also blocked by their self-reported history of PTSD. And so you can see most people are saying that they find it helpful. Most people don't think it's dangerous, but there are some people in here that are reporting that they did find aspects of it to be dangerous. And if you kind of look at the proportion of this, it seems like this is more prevalent in those that had a history of PTSD to say that they found aspects of it dangerous. And then, after them just kind of asking that basic binary question, yes, no, was this dangerous or not, I wanted to dig into the details of, okay, well, why did you think it was helpful or dangerous? And so this is where the open-ended responses came in, and just these kind of pages and pages of text. I think at the end of the day, with all 500 people, there's about 500 or 600 pages that we had to read. And so the way that I did this was what am I trying to say here? So I think this is just kind of getting more into the fact that we see more of these people that find it to be dangerous, specifically, those that actually report. So not everyone that said yes or no actually wanted to divulge in more detail by submitting an open-ended response, whether they found it to be dangerous or not. So there were more people actually that had a history of PTSD that were willing to share their negative experiences, which I found kind of interesting. So it might have been something that wasn't pleasant for them, but because they're engaging in this research and they want to help inform us, I felt like maybe they felt, I need to tell this story. I need this to be known because other people with PTSD should know that there are things that you need to worry about if you want to explore this as an option for therapy. And then what we did was we took all these pages of text, and I had myself and two other independent raters each read them on our own, independently of each other, without kind of telling each other what we were identifying, and we each came up with our themes that we were able to derive based on reading the content. And thankfully, we actually all came up with the same themes, pretty much. I mean, with some minor details aside, we all pretty much came up with these major themes. So I'll start with the dangerous experiences first. And so this is just like reading through the text, okay, how many times was this mentioned, and then blocked by whether they had a self-reported history of PTSD or not. And so the main thing that popped out was physical complications, which seemed to be more prominent in people with PTSD. People with PTSD, like I said, they have this like chronic stress response, they have lots of cortisol in their system, and usually they have a lot of cardiovascular complications. So having these physical complications might be kind of a potentially dangerous thing for people with PTSD, given kind of that. And ayahuasca does kind of have cardiovascular complications associated with it. People with heart conditions are not advised to take ayahuasca, although they do sometimes, but it's really kind of counterindicated, especially if you have PTSD. But some other things that popped up, so it seems like the most prominent one was aspects of there being an unsafe setting. So like I said, there's this ayahuasca tourism happening, and there's a lot of these sort of neo-shamans or kind of people trying to exploit all these Westerners wanting to seek out ayahuasca, and there's a lot of harm being done in that context, people being swindled for their money, sexual assault, things like that. A lot of panic and internal fears, so just kind of feeling out of control, which seemed to be kind of ubiquitous across everyone. I figured something like that would be more prominent in people with PTSD, but it was actually more prominent in those that didn't report a history of PTSD, maybe because, you know, the symptoms that people with PTSD feel are a little bit more physical and real, and the rest of it is just maybe just panic and anxiety of not having control of your visual and experiential space. Let's see, there was some, yep.
Did anyone in the survey report if they were using SSRIs?
Yeah, I'll get into that in quantitative data in a minute. What else? Unethical facilitators, I think that also ties into unsafe setting. A lot of these facilities would have way too many people sitting in ceremonies, so there just wasn't enough one-on-one supervision and help that people needed. Some people couldn't figure out how to get to the bathroom. There was some aspect of just kind of people owning up that they just didn't prepare enough and they didn't do their research, and maybe they were taking a contraindicated medication even though they knew they weren't supposed to. And then also with people with PTSD, there seemed to be an issue about who else was sitting in ceremony with them, so being really selective about who you're going to be sharing this altered state of consciousness with. You know, if somebody is kind of giving you a bad vibe, you know, that could be a really terrible thing when you're in this altered state and you're struggling with, you know, PTSD symptoms. So that was another prominent thing that came up.
So this data, oh, sorry.
No, you go, Chris, and then.
Okay, so this data is just of the people who answered dangerous as opposed to helpful.
Right.
Okay.
So it was like, did you find it dangerous? Yes. Why?
Okay.
So at the very top for use of cannabis, would that suggest that use of cannabis was protective from having a dangerous experience?
No, this was somebody that thought, and you can't even see the bar, so it was like maybe one person that said this, where they thought that using cannabis made them feel worse, that they thought it was a bad interaction for them. And I mean, if you go to some of these retreat centers, they actually don't let you smoke pot. If you do, they get really upset. So this was just somebody kind of breaking the rules, and it wasn't that common, but it's kind of its own thing. Back.
Yeah, so you actually asked them dangerous specifically?
Mm-hmm.
It just seems like that could be a bit of a confound because they might feel that it was unhelpful, but not that it was dangerous, and might inflate your helpful responses, because that's the better of the two options, even though it doesn't capture perhaps an unhelpful or unpleasant experience. So I was just, did you account for it in some fashion?
Well, I was trying to, so when I was reading the themes, I would pick up, even if it was the dangerous or the helpful one, if they were talking about something they found dangerous within the context of the helpful question, I coded that as a danger. But I guess I'm not quite sure what your question is.
Well, if I'm presented with it's helpful or it's dangerous, I might say like, well, I hated that experience, but it wasn't dangerous, so I guess I'll go helpful.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. Well, we had an option of unsure
Okay.
as well,
Okay.
if they couldn't
So
quite
you can
differentiate that. But I think, I mean, the responses we got, at least from the text, were pretty strong. Like, this was bad, or this was amazing, you know, it was pretty
Dangerous could also
polarized.
be confounded with like, I didn't trust the shaman. I feel like a dangerous environment versus the actual experience of doing ayahuasca.
Yeah, that did come out a little bit, and so I think I coded that as like either panic or something like that, or maybe it wasn't something dangerous about the situation itself, but more of like their interpretation of what
Okay.
they were experiencing. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's exactly what I was trying to, could it be helpful and dangerous?
Yes, so there were people that responded to both,
Yeah.
and some people were reporting what they observed to be dangerous rather than what they experienced to be dangerous. And then they would kind of answer in the same vein for the different questions, but then kind of change the valence of it a little bit to say, well, if you don't have this, then it would be dangerous, or if this were there, it would have been helpful. So it was kind of just trying to tease through the text and coding it in the right theme according to what it sounded like they were trying to say, whether they thought it was actually dangerous or not. Does that answer your questions? Anyone else?
What was the ratio of participants that had their experience at a retreat center versus self-administration?
Yeah, I have that in a graph later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Graphs.
Okay. So this is just kind of getting into the details of what people said specifically. So for, like I said, physical complications was kind of the most thing. That included increased heart rate and blood pressure, problems breathing, exhaustion and dehydration, and unsteady gait. Complications with other participants in the ceremony, like I said, overcrowding, lack of screening for unstable people. There were seemingly some violent people in the crowd that made others feel very uncomfortable. So this was kind of, you know, bad on the facilitators for not properly doing a good intake of who was going to be sitting together. Psychological complications, so these are things like internal fears and panic, intense emotions, feeling out of control. There were a few sort of like psychotic responses where people saw entities, or were saying that they were having hallucinations for a prolonged period after. This isn't common, but it is something that could happen if there's a predisposition to that, given the nature of how these things impact the brain and the serotonergic system. It was interesting when I was talking to my colleague Bia Labate, who's from Brazil, and this idea of what we think of as psychosis as Westerners and how they think about it. And so the presence of entities, if you were to tell your psychiatrist that, they would think, okay, you're having some delusional thinking. Whereas there, they're like, no, that's an actual spiritual encounter. So they wouldn't pathologize it in that way. So it's kind of interesting to think about and how you would code that. Because when I submitted this to her, she's the editor of this book that this is in, and she was like, I don't know if I would consider that a bad thing. But this is kind of under the lens of the Western medical model. So unsafe setting and no supervision. So a lot of these centers, even though they're trying to act like they can treat various physical or mental health complications, they don't actually have any medical staff on site to support people if there's a complication, and that felt very unsafe to people. Lack of one-on-one support from the shaman or any of the facilitators or helpers that they're supposed to have. Language barriers, so somebody going down to Peru, they don't speak Spanish, the facilitators don't speak English, and so you just kind of not really understanding what's going on. Some people felt that was dangerous. Some of the places would be sitting around a fire, and I don't know if that's necessarily dangerous. I mean, I guess they could stumble into the fire, but I don't know, that's something I feel like can be mitigated pretty easily. Some of these retreat centers would just let people kind of wander off into the jungle. The place that I was at, we actually all would sit in a tent by ourselves deep in the jungle. There was no group ceremony, and so I'm not surprised that somebody died as a result of that. Without, you're vomiting, you could choke. You need to have supervision, and you need to not be wandering around where a jaguar could get you, or who knows. I mean, it's an interesting place. And a lot of people, and again, this was also a cultural difference that the editor of the book was like, I don't think that's an issue, but some people felt very uncomfortable with the shaman drinking with them, and that their facilitator was also intoxicated. But that's very common practice in the Amazon for the shaman. And actually, the more traditional aspects of ayahuasca, the participants wouldn't take ayahuasca, the shaman would. And then they'd be able to see what was going on with the person and figure out what other plant medicines they would need to heal them. So the people taking the ayahuasca themselves is sort of a new thing in that culture. Let's see, access to purging facilities. So some people just weren't, the bathroom might have been in the next hut, so they'd have to walk through the jungle to get there, and it was dark, and that seemed a little dangerous, and not having somebody to help them walk. I don't know if anybody's tried to walk when you're on ayahuasca. It's, not easy. Not being prepared. So a lot of people, if you're going to take ayahuasca, you have to follow a very strict diet. You have to make sure you're not eating certain foods, you're not engaging in sexual activity. There's all these different things that are part of this dieta that it seems like a lot of people didn't follow, and then once they were in the experience, were kind of blaming that adverse reactions they were having on the fact that they weren't following the rules. People taking contraindicated medications that would have bad interactions with the monoamine oxidase inhibitors that are in the tea. Pre-existing conditions that aren't good, like psychosis or heart conditions. For people with PTSD, if it was too soon after their trauma, they felt that it actually wasn't very helpful because they were probably still too activated, and it was like that kind of adverse reaction to exposure therapy that might have been going on. And then just facilitators not educating people about what risks to expect when going into it. Some shamans will add datura. Who here has heard of datura? Okay, it's kind of like a dissociative, or it's a nasty
Deliriant.
compound, and some shamans like to put it in there to make their tea seem more potent, but it can be really dangerous. And a lot of centers will give people a tobacco purge where they have you drink tobacco juice. And this is kind of common down in the Amazon, but they like build up a tolerance to it. So there's been actually some reports of people going down there and dying from tobacco poisoning because they give them the same concentration of tobacco juice that they would give their native, their indigenous population, or people that come to ceremony regularly, and it would just be too much, and it would make them way too sick. So that was an issue. What else? Unethical facilitators. So like I said, there's rampant sexual abuse, financial exploitation, this concern over whether they're a witch doctor, if they're an actual shaman, or if they're what they call brujo, which is this kind of like, they're doing black magic. And then just legal concerns, people not really sure, especially for people doing ayahuasca in somebody's living room in New York or something, they're can't really dive into their experience because they're like wondering, are the cops gonna show up? I'm breaking the law right now. So there's kind of that issue that made people feel very unsafe. Some of the centers didn't have any follow-up care, so no process in place for integrating their experience or checking on them to see if they were okay. A lot of people with PTSD that claimed this felt that put them at risk of self-harm, especially if something came up and then there was nobody to talk to about it and kind of process that. Dogmatic practices. So has anybody interfaced with Santa Daime or the UDV? So these are these Brazilian religions that use ayahuasca as a sacrament, and they're very dogmatic. And the Santa Daime in particular has a lot of very strict gender roles where they have all the women on one side and all the men on another side, and you're not allowed to mingle, and they make you stand and dance and do all this stuff, and it's a very intense process. And so in the San Francisco community in particular, where there's a huge, well, I guess all over the country now, but like for the people that are in the trans community, having these strict gender roles seemed very aversive to them, and it's like, which side of the room are they supposed to be on? And that sort of cultural context wasn't really appropriate for them and felt very harmful to them. Inexperienced facilitator. So like I said, there's a lot of people popping up claiming to be shamans. Someone goes down to the jungle and says, hey, I did ayahuasca, I can be a shaman. But the reports of that happening and the adverse reactions that people are having to these neo-shamans, as they're called, is quite prevalent. And so there's like the fact that they don't know what they're doing, they don't know how to hold space, and then just the person recognizing that they don't have experience and just not feeling they can trust the person that's running the ceremony, and if they can't do that, then they can't let go, they can't fully experience what they need to with this medicine. And then the use of cannabis, like I said, smoking marijuana during ceremony. I can't remember if somebody thought that was an issue or if them themselves that made them have a bad reaction, but it was just like one or two people. Okay, now getting into the helpful stuff. So this is kind of like, again, this was more like what I presented with all these dangerous situations that was very much in the minority. It was present, but not as prevalent as all the helpful experiences. These people just wanted to gush about how amazing they found ayahuasca to be, which was very encouraging. Oops, didn't circle anything here. So here we have, the main thing was, feeling that the facilitators were experienced and that they had adequate support and help. Music was a huge part of this. Almost everyone said having the Icaros, which are these songs sung in the native language there, or even just having their own music. Some people like to play instruments, but having some sort of, this is seen in also like the scientific research that's happening where the music is a really important component to facilitate the experience, or at least give them that guide. Having a supportive group and a safe, comfortable space, making sure they're adequately prepared, having different comforts like ginger tea to help with nausea, blankets, pillows, things like that. I don't want to go into the details too much. I mean, you can kind of get a sense, people really like when the shaman is singing, or there's live music playing, or they themselves can play instruments, feeling that they can trust the person that they're sitting with, feeling that the group that they're with are people that they can trust. People like to be with a community that they feel some kind of connection to. So like when I was in Peru, the veterans really wanted to be with other veterans. They wanted to feel like they were with people that really understood what they were going through. And so I think that's a big component to that, making sure there's aftercare set up. And one of the things people report is that they did actually feel an alleviation from their symptoms from this as being kind of the helpful aspect. So, getting into quantitative outcomes. So before I dig into some meaty graphs, does anybody have any questions?
Oh gosh.
This is just all of them. I'm not gonna go through all of them in this tiny little format, but just kind of like, this is me trying to make sense of like everything I asked these people. I asked them a lot. So the survey was this was actually version 1. The one I just presented you was kind of a modification I did to try and get, to make it less cumbersome to take, because there were so many questions and I really wanted to dig more into the qualitative aspects of the experience. And so this was like I think only like 40% of the people completed the survey at the end, and when I modified it a little to make it less intense, I still had a 50% dropout, but at least I got 10% more people to submit data. But again, just kind of like the workflow of how I included data. So at the time that I took this snapshot for these quantitative analyses, this was mid-2017, we had about 780 people that took it, but only about half that completed it. About 15 more people withdrew consent. Again, there was that one underage person. And then I dug into the details more about their history of PTSD, and so the people that declined to answer whether they had a PTSD, I dropped. And then in the question about where they took ayahuasca, some people said they'd never taken ayahuasca, or they only did DMT, and so I excluded those people. You have a question?
How many items did you have originally, and how many in the second version?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, a lot. So this is trying to give you a sense. So I think for the second version, I took out, I think I kept in, I took out these sort of like questionnaire-based things.
Did you have any sort of reliability or consistency items built into it?
No.
Did I just hear you right that you dropped the PTSD checklist?
Yeah, in the second version. So instead of like validating, because the answer was usually pretty, like if they said they had PTSD,
They really did.
they would have it. There was a little bit of people that were past that maybe still were symptomatic, or people that thought that they still had PTSD who didn't, but that was.
So you felt that was still close enough?
Yeah, I mean, there's limitations to.
Cool.
It's a
Just curious.
problematic measure, it's very face valid, and people may just endorse it anyway.
Yeah. And it's meant to be, the PTSD checklist is meant to be a triage, so that the clinician will be like, I need to do a full CAPS, which is where they kind of ask the same questions, but then they actually assess your answers rather than you writing it down. But we weren't able to intervene with these people and contact them to actually ask them in person, so caveats for sure. Anyway, so after all that said and done, making sure they actually did take ayahuasca, this data set had a final cohort of about 300 people, again with about half saying that had a history of PTSD. And then the things I wanted to look at, just basic demographics, like how old are these people, where were they from, details about their ayahuasca, so like where did they take it, how many times have they taken it, how long has it been since they took it, any changes in their symptoms. So this was just, again, a self-report, kind of strongly agree, strongly disagree, you saw reductions in these kind of major aspects of symptoms for PTSD, and then also changes in drug use. So asking not only recreational drug use, but also any prescriptions that they might have been on before they took ayahuasca and how that changed afterwards. Any integration techniques they used, and then all of these are sort of these questionnaire-based self-reports that I had them answer. One was to get at social support. There's the post-traumatic growth inventory. This is kind of the opposite of the PTSD checklist, where it's looking at measures of resiliency and how well people can adapt to adverse situations. In this context, I asked them to answer this question in the context of their ayahuasca experience rather than their trauma. So I wanted to see how they were responding to the ayahuasca experience itself. And then this was the Beck's Depression Inventory and the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. Just some basic demographics. So getting at kind of the self-reported PTSD diagnosis versus what the PTSD checklist said. Sorry, where's my mouse? So this is the PTSD checklist. Higher on the score means more severe symptoms. Again, self-report. But we do see that the people with the current diagnosis, that claim to have a current diagnosis of PTSD, were scoring pretty high on this. But then those people also had very high scores on depression as well, which is interesting but not surprising. The group with no PTSD had the lowest scores, but there's still some that were kind of scoring pretty high, so maybe there's some issues there that we're not picking up. But it was just kind of a nice sanity check to say, okay, the people with past scored lower. The people with claiming they were currently symptomatic do kind of have these higher scores. And this is just something I'm seeing pop up, that people that are most severe with PTSD usually also have depression. So I think it's kind of challenging trying to tease those two out. And they might be getting confused for each other. Or it might be a separate thing. I don't know. That's actually something the other part of my lab is working on independently of psychedelics.
With that, I assume there was no way to tell whether that depression was active prior to trauma.
Well, this was asking them, yeah, so I didn't ask them, well, it's just more like a state of like, where were they, what was their mental state when they took the survey?
Okay.
Rather than them saying, how did you feel about your depression before you took PTSD?
Yeah, because I was just mainly thinking of going, okay, is that depression potentially a precursor
Right.
to how susceptible they are to having PTSD?
Right, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'll go into detail of that. So this gets into kind of, okay, who are these people? Again, blocked by the self-report of a current PTSD, past PTSD, or no PTSD. So we have mostly civilians. There were some veterans that submitted the survey, but we pretty much mostly get civilians. And then for times tried, I kind of just made this a categorical variable. Most people kind of fit into this more than 10 times because we got a lot of people that were part of these religious groups that are taking this every weekend. So that's why I kind of use that as its own category, because it's kind of its own thing that goes anywhere up to, like, you know, I've done it 3,000 times, which is a little intense. But you kind of see most people, it's like there's first timers, and you have some people that maybe done it more than that, and then you just get this like huge influx of people who have done it a lot. In terms of where they actually took it, so I asked them, did you take it at a South American retreat or at a South American church, the US church, some other place in the US, anywhere outside of the Americas? Never tried it before, and then other. And so other was just people writing in that they did mushrooms or they did DMT, and so I had to exclude those data at some point. But most people, it seemed like they were going down to the Amazon to take it at some retreat center. And then the second most people were taking it in the US, probably at, you know, these underground ceremonies that happen. I can't tell you where they happen, but they do happen quite a lot. Someone brings in a shaman, or they've decided to be a shaman themselves, and then they find a way to make ayahuasca, and then they host it in their house or something. So that happens quite a bit. Outside of the Americas, that was just kind of broad. That could have been in any context. There's a lot of stuff going on in Europe. And then this is just sort of people, the text that came out of that other category. Some people just doing it one-on-one with a shaman without any details about where that was. Like I said, a lot of people doing it in Europe and Canada. Some people saying they were doing it with an indigenous community that wasn't a church or a retreat center. A little bit in South Africa. Some people doing it at home by themselves. Reading up a recipe on Erowid and making it on their own, which I wouldn't recommend. But and then some people just saying they did DMT, and some people saying they just do it with some friends. So this is that post-traumatic growth inventory I was telling you about, again, blocked by their PTSD status. And so, no surprise, these people are not really having great responses to their ayahuasca experience if they claim to currently have PTSD. They didn't feel like it was really helping them relate to others or find new possibilities or personal strength or spiritual change. So it could be that if, you know, their PTSD is too severe, it might not be having the same effect that they're wanting. That, you know, I've talked about this a lot with Rick Doblin, based on some of the results that came out of this survey, and that, you know, maybe people that aren't as severe with PTSD could use that. Maybe they could benefit from doing MDMA first and then doing ayahuasca. Because yeah, I think if your symptoms are too severe, the ayahuasca really is not appropriate. And then this just gets to kind of this self-report of like, did you notice there was any changes in your symptoms after you took ayahuasca? And again, there's some limitations with this because we're kind of just taking them at their word and we don't know how long it's been, or like one question I didn't have when I tried to submit this for publication that the reviewer asked that I couldn't answer was, how long has it been since their trauma? And I think that would have been helpful because it's kind of useful to know kind of maybe how symptomatic they might be, how fresh is their trauma, and how does that confound any of these results. So take that limitation as I talk about this. But for the most part, people are claiming that they're seeing reductions in their symptoms. So white bars up here means that they feel like their symptoms got much better. And you kind of see this across the board for things like, so these are the kind of the major symptoms that we would see with PTSD, which is re-experiencing avoidance, negative thoughts, and hyperarousal. And then I asked just a basic question about depression and suicidal thoughts. And then I asked them kind of again, remember 1 week after your experience and then a month after your experience, how were you feeling, to see if there was any changes. And I mean, they look pretty similar. There was kind of this uptick here in hyperarousal, getting much worse. I think these were people, again, in that severe category of PTSD. I don't have it blocked here based on that, but that in digging into the details, it seems like, you know, like that exposure effect, that activating effect that ayahuasca has might have had this kind of persistent, or at least this acute kind of hyperarousal response that maybe wasn't as pleasant, but it seemed to subside after about a month. And then substance use changes, so this was just sort of drugs of abuse. Again, white would mean that there's kind of a reduction, which would be a good thing. So we see a lot of decrease in alcohol use reported, tobacco. Seems some people ended up doing more psychedelics afterwards, so maybe like an integration strategy, and cannabis as well. And smoking, a little bit. I don't know if that's a thing. I noticed there was a lot of people that would just smoke. There's like the mapacho tobacco that's like this sacred tobacco. A lot of people start smoking after taking that, so I don't know if that's what that's getting at.
Does no change mean like they weren't doing it before and now they're still not doing it?
No
Or is
change
that-
means that they said, I didn't notice any change. Not that they didn't answer it, but that they just said, I didn't notice it get better or worse. It's kind of neutral. And then getting at, someone asked a question about medications that they were on. So I asked them, what were you taking before you did ayahuasca, and did any of that change after you took ayahuasca? And so I blocked this by the people that said they'd never had PTSD, and then combined the people with a past or current diagnosis. Obviously, we see a lot more people that are just on the various therapies for PTSD, like SSRIs and anti-anxieties, and doing cognitive behavioral therapy. And you see that decrease, at least the report of it, that they no longer need these medications after they take ayahuasca. And you do see some of that in the people with no PTSD for whatever reason. I didn't have like a skid or some other way to kind of assess what other comorbidities they might have had and what they've been treated for. So another limitation. And then there was this category, you know, with medical marijuana, it seemed there wasn't much of a change, a slight decrease, but not much, not to the extent that these were having. So they're kind of just like, yes, I like smoking weed, I'm going to do it regardless. That was more so in the people with the history of PTSD than those that don't. And then in this other category, which again was open text, I said, what were you doing before? There was a lot of meditation, marijuana. I don't know why they didn't just add it in here. I guess there was a distinction between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. Some people were taking psychedelics, some people were doing nothing, psychotherapy. And then this one just popped up after ayahuasca. They're like, nothing. I didn't need anything. That was very, very prominent. Like, ayahuasca fixed me. You know, there's that. So there's this sort of self-selecting bias in the cohort of just, you know, these people have a very strong affinity and a love for ayahuasca because, you know, if they took the survey, it changed their life, they want to talk about it. And so I feel like that's kind of an over-exaggeration of that. And then reported integration techniques. So I'd asked them of the ones that I felt were interesting, just kind of based on talking to people that do integration work in San Francisco. You know, and so I said, you know, meditation seemed to be a big one, that makes sense. Yoga, doing individual therapy with a psychotherapist, group therapy. Somatic experiencing is one that a lot of people do with PTSD because it helps with the kind of the somatic symptoms with the hypervigilance. And then kind of just the random ones that I just let people just kind of tell me, what are your methods of integration? I think I might know what's important, but what do you guys think is important? Exercise was a big one, just kind of really developing a more healthy lifestyle afterwards, and after discovering that what they were doing wasn't helping, and probably all their poor eating and not exercising and all that stuff was really kind of exacerbating their symptoms. Some people claim they don't need to do anything. There's a lot of dancing and writing, spending time in nature. I mean, just basically all these things that are like, yeah, being happy and healthy and engaging in community and doing things that get you out and moving your body and putting good things in your body and interacting with other like-minded people. So that was interesting. Yes?
Psychotherapy is tiny. What's up with that? I would think that would be kind of a staple integration technique.
Well, it could just, people aren't thinking about psychotherapy as integration.
Oh, okay.
No.
Well, I guess as a treatment rather than, is that the same thing?
I mean, I think this is like, some people are thinking of that, but like if people think, no, psychotherapy is therapy. Psychotherapy is not integration.
Okay, all
I don't
right.
know. People are very dogmatic, especially in the Bay Area, about what integration is. And
I'm sure a lot of therapists also don't know about ayahuasca and probably wouldn't be able to help with the integration.
yeah.
It should be integration.
We're trying to change that. We have a therapy network that we've developed, which is several clinicians in the community that are willing to kind of offer their services, not to give people psychedelics, but to help them talk about an experience that they had without, being shamed for being a drug user. But again, it's like it's all still kind of new. Like, well, what is integration? And like I said, I keep referencing my colleague Bia Labate, but to her, she's like, all you Americans in your integration, like having to journal and talk to other people and talk to a therapist. And she's like, for us, integration is sitting in your room and just processing it in your mind. And like, it's a very personal thing that you don't share with anybody. So she kind of scoffs at this idea of integration being this group process or this thing that you need to share with other people. But that's very big for us, I think.
Yeah.
So, just cultural differences. And then I already showed all this. This is just getting at that helpful, dangerous question. And then I had one other question. This was mostly just to fill out data from this other survey I had seen online, where they basically asked across 52 different experience categories how they would rate different drugs. And so there was drugs like LSD and MDMA and cannabis and alcohol and prescription medications. And it was a really interesting data set, but there was only one response for ayahuasca. So I wanted to fill that out with this survey. So I asked that same question for ayahuasca, and it was just a range of things of like that had either a negative association with them or positive. So like, did you find the experience to be anxiety inducing? Strongly agree, strongly disagree, or neutral? All the way to, was it a mystical experience? Was it worth it? Or was it dangerous or difficult? And so for the most part, with the white bars being that they agree, you see that most of them are trending towards them being positive experiences, with less of them being negative experiences, although the more prominent negative ones would be anxiety producing, because it is kind of have this response where it elevates your blood pressure and your heart rate, so that's going to cause some anxiety. Bodily discomfort was a big one. Like I said, you're vomiting. It's just an unpleasant physical experience. They found it difficult and long-lasting, but they also found it to be very wonderful, all the other domains here. So let's take that. So in wrapping up all of that, so while the current study supports the literature regarding safety and therapeutic potential of ayahuasca for alleviating some of these symptoms, there are some potential risks that I think clinicians and researchers and also patients that are thinking about this as a therapy should be considering if they want to try this to treat PTSD. I would say have a very strong communication plan with your current therapist. Let them know you're going to go do it, and then have a plan for when you come back for talking to them about it. And then more related to the qualitative data, that the therapeutic and ritualistic settings in the context of treating trauma should be equipped with the appropriate monitoring equipment and measures to counteract any potential cardiovascular complications or other psychological complications that come about. There should be experienced clinicians and shamans and trained supportive staff, and just having things to make them comfortable and let them really surrender. And set and setting is just so important. Making sure they're in the right mindset, they've done their work, they're prepared, they have the mental space to process what happens when they get home, and that they're with a group of people that they can really trust, so that they can go deep and not feel like they're going to be harmed in some way other than what's going on in their own mind. So just, these are the people that helped me with this project. Obviously, Rick Doblin from MAPS. This is Ali Fiducia. She's now heading the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which is sort of the for-profit aspect of MAPS, where they're going to be the pharmaceutical company making MDMA, and all the sales from that will go back into MAPS to fund the research. So that's what the Public Benefit Corporation is. It's for-profit, but all the profits go back into benefiting the public. This is Bia Labate. She's an anthropologist. She's been deeply ingrained in the ayahuasca research world for a very long time. She runs the plant medicine track at Psychedelic Science, and she was recently hired by MAPS. And these are the two other raters and co-authors of this book chapter that I presented. Julie Megler, she's a psychiatric nurse practitioner in San Francisco, and then Clancy Kavner is a clinical psychologist also in San Francisco.